Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Behind the Frames. I'm your host, Jorge Edwards. As you can see in the bottom of my square, you can find me at Jorge B. Edwards on Twitter. Don't forget to head over to Fantasy and Frames and follow us on Twitter there as well. We're really happy to be back with you. Thank you so much to everybody who watched our inaugural episode last week. We're here every week. We're giving you all the latest news in the world of fantasy football. Woo! You can't say fantasy football with adding the woo at the end, so fantasy football. Woo! I'm very excited. We're all very excited to be here. Let's talk to the cast right now. Aaron Pags, aka at Fantasy Triage. How are you doing tonight?
Dude, another live show and a beautiful night to say Fantasy Football Lives.
Woo! Nate Markham, sir, how are you?
Doing great. How about you guys? Well, I know how you guys are doing. We're talking about Fantasy Football Live, for crying out loud. You're doing awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, my I don't want to say trusty steed because that sounds horrible, but my right-hand man for the past few years. Does that sound better? Yeah, that sounds a lot better than trusty steed. Ken Sonnenberg, you can find him at Fantasy FB Ken1. We got to work on that Twitter handle, but we'll get there eventually. Ken, how are you doing tonight?
I donated that. Not donated. I got that Twitter handle. Somebody gave that to me.
Okay, so
I think it's a pretty good one, actually.
Well, the me of 2 years ago thanks you for saying that, but the me of now.
You've grown up so much in these last. You've grown up so much in these last couple of years.
I know I have.
I mean, before my eyes.
Well, thank you very much. That means a lot to me.
Yeah.
Speaking of Ken and myself, we recently put out a podcast for our fantasy football podcast here at fantasyandframes.com, Fourth and Frames, which you can follow also on Twitter at Fourth and Frames, where we're talking about the fantasy football relevant players on offense in the AFC East. Now, Nate Markham, you're our IDP guy here at Fantasy and Frames. You'll be doing you'll be contributing to our divisional previews, where we're going to be talking about both offense and defense, specifically IDP. So we're looking forward to your analysis in the coming weeks there. With that, folks, let's just get down to business. We don't want to waste your time here. Let's get down to our news, and what is bigger news for us here at Fantasy and Frames than the Four-Eyed Championships? We talked about it last week during our inaugural episode. You have Scott Fishbowl. Scott Fish, friend of the show. We love Scott Fish. He does great work in the community for Fantasy Cares. Everyone's tweeting their I got into Scott Fishbowl 10 posts on Twitter. It is Christmas. Is it, or the holidays? I want to generalize this one. It is like the holiday season for us in the fantasy football community. So it feels great. But we want to do our part as well. We want to make sure that Fantasy and Frames represents all the charities that are out there. So that's why we have the Four-Eyed Championships. And I use plural for championships because it's pretty simple, folks. We're going to have 4 divisions, 12-team divisions. Each division champion, before the playoff starts, whoever that is, the charity that you chose to represent will automatically get $100. We're giving $100 to each of the division championships charities. So from there, we have an overall league champion in the playoffs. We're going to have 8 teams in the playoffs. And then the money that we raise on our GoFundMe page, which is active and will be posted on Twitter and Facebook, on our Facebook page, that money will go to the overall league's champions charity of choice. Now, let's be honest. There's a lot going on in the world, especially with COVID-19. So we're introducing a special COVID-19 clause. And the issue is, and the clause is this. Let's say, we get to week 5 or week 6, and then God forbid something happens and there's no more football. What are we supposed to do with all this charity money we raised on our GoFundMe page? Very simple. We're just going to split it 4 ways between whoever is in the lead in each division and just give it to that charity. I feel like that's the most fair way to go about it. And to be honest with you, if football shuts down and a lot of people are getting sick in this country, I think charities are going to need all the resources and donations that they can get, and you can say no to charity. You guys agree? Yes, that sounds pretty awesome.
Yes, that's the way to go.
Yep, I agree.
All right. So also we're going to be having on fantasyframes.com our page for the 4A championships, where we'll have all the rules, we'll have all the roster positions. We'll have everything you need. So head over to fantasyframes.com. I want to say by the end of the weekend, we'll have that page up. And don't forget, if you're interested in joining us in the 4A championships, use the hashtag #IWantIn. You see it scrolling at the bottom of your screen with EYE wants in. Let everyone know, in the fantasy football community, that you want to be a part of joining this league that's all about helping out the different charities that are out there. And with that, let's get into some fantasy football news, shall we, gentlemen?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we're ready.
Sounds like
all
fun.
right. Let's start big and let's go big, gentlemen. Colin Kaepernick. Last week the NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell stated that he would be totally okay with Colin Kaepernick coming back into the NFL, and actually encouraged NFL owners to give him a shot. Today, Anthony Lynn of the Los Angeles Chargers, not the San Diego Chargers, Nate Markham,
Of Anaheim.
Right.
Los Angeles Chargers of Anaheim, exactly.
Right.
They came out and said that Colin Kaepernick would be a fit for the offense that they're trying to run in Los Angeles. Let's just go around the horn here, and not to take a trademarked phrase there from around the horn on ESPN. But Aaron, what are your thoughts on Colin Kaepernick in the NFL?
Yeah, it's easy for Anthony Lynn to say, right? He doesn't have a true starting quarterback, so he's probably interested in every single person who could throw a football, with Tyrod Taylor and Justin Herbert, trying to replace NFL Hall of Famer and Phillip Rivers. So why would he not be interested in Colin Kaepernick or anybody? Man, it's been a long time since Kaepernick actually played football. I know he's been pretty prevalent in social justice causes, which is great. And that keeps him on the mind of football fans, and probably on the back of the minds of a lot of fantasy football players. He has not been fantasy football relevant since 2016. And in that year, he was a pretty decent, he was a startable fantasy option, He only played 11 games, but in those 11 games, he was, at least a decent quarterback. And so if he were to come back, I think this is the only thing we need to know, right? If he were to come back and get a job in the league, where do we see fantasy value, since we're a fantasy football show? And so I'm going to start off by saying that clearly, as a backup in the NFL, he is not, or with no job in the NFL, he is not someone that you want to draft unless you're playing in we draft everyone in the NFL type of league. So you could forget about Colin Kaepernick until he signs with the team. That being said, my favorite landing spot for him would be the Kansas City Chiefs, defending Super Bowl champs. I think Andy Reid has already proven that he can handle the reclamation project, i.e. Michael Vick, these types of guys who have been negative in the spotlight and kind of just fallen in line behind Reid. He runs, obviously, a great offense for a quarterback who's slightly mobile. Kaepernick's more than slightly mobile. Mahomes, even last year, was a little banged up, missed a couple games. Kansas City's backup quarterback is Chad Henne, who has thrown less passes than Colin Kaepernick since 2016. He's only thrown 5 in the league. Wow. And Kaepernick played 11 games in 2016. So they don't have a good backup quarterback situation. Mahomes is, every quarterback can get injured, of course, but the guys who move around, they tend to get hit more. And we've already seen it once with Mahomes. Perfect spot for somebody who can fill in for the Chiefs. And, someone we may talk about streaming with all those offensive weapons around him, should he be the backup in Kansas City.
That's a good point. But let me go back quickly to his Colin Kaepernick's 2016 season, the last time he played. Like you said, 11 games, weeks 6 through 17. He missed week 8. 18 total touchdowns, 4 interceptions, was averaging 18.2 fantasy points per game during that stretch. He accumulated 2,241 passing yards, 468 rushing yards. So think of that profile of a player, okay? Now let's go back to 2016 when Anthony Lynn was the offensive coordinator for the Buffalo Bills and Tyrod Taylor was his quarterback. Let's look at this stat line. 3,023 passing yards, 580 rushing yards, 18.1 fantasy points per game. I think Anthony Lynn has shown that with that dual style threat of quarterback, he can scheme something up to make them fantasy relevant. you look at what Kaepernick did going back to 2016. I think that was the Chip Kelly year where he had no business being, well, Chip Kelly had no business being in the NFL as far as head coach, and Kaepernick was just kind of just thrown in there, right? And he basically winged this season to 18.2 fantasy points per game. I can see some similarities there in Los Angeles for the Chargers in terms of what Anthony Lynn is going to do there. Obviously, he couldn't employ that same style of system with Phillip Rivers there because Rivers is a pocket passing quarterback. But going with what you were saying as far as where I would want or where I could see Kaepernick going is not so much from a fantasy football perspective, is more just like a, overarching perspective. Why not go to Minnesota? We talk about, teams where, I don't even know who the backup quarterback is in Minnesota for starters. Second, we always talk about mobile quarterbacks and the running game and how they both feed off of each other. Well, if you have Dalvin Cook, or as it's trending now, if you have Alexander Madison on your team and you introduce a mobile quarterback, that can only open up things more in the running game. So what better spot to have, like, the heart of where, all this went down with George Floyd, and then have the opportunity for the Vikings. I just feel like that's a match made in social and fantasy football heaven. What are your thoughts on that, Ken?
Minnesota is a good place. It's not my first choice. If I was to choose, I would go with the coach that seems to be the most interested in him and recently said that he should have taken him. I look at Pete Carroll in Seattle. You got Russell Wilson there, who is let's call him a mid-sized mobile quarterback. He's not he's not Eli Manning, Statue of Liberty back there, but he's also not,
he's
Michael
short.
Vick.
Just say that he's short.
Yeah, he's got but I think that's an environment that is great. Would be great for Kaepernick. He'd be in a city that probably be very welcoming to him. He'll sit behind Russell Wilson. Now, the one thing about it is he'll sit behind Russell Wilson, who in his career has never missed a game. So Russell Wilson is not exactly an injury threat, but as you get older, he's Russell Wilson's going to be 32 this year. I believe 32. 32 in November. He'll be 32 this year. Not getting any younger, so it's a good situation for Kaepernick to be in, and I like Seattle.
That's a very good point. Another one I didn't think about earlier was, what about Baltimore? Greg Roman, he was did I just steal your thunder?
Nope, I had two. I was going to go with two since I was last. And Baltimore with Greg Roman. Continue with what you're saying.
No.
You're exactly right. You're trending in the perfect direction is with the Greg Roman talk, because that's
he was the offensive coordinator when Kaepernick was successful in San Francisco. There's familiarity there. I don't know how the team feels personally about RG3, but that's an option that makes somewhat sense. Nate, who do you think, or where do you think Kaepernick should go?
Well, like you said, Baltimore was one from a good fit, obviously, given the situation. And, I look at, for fantasy purposes and like social situations, combining the two, I'm going to go to Philadelphia. Not exactly – I love Jalen Hurts. I really want him to get an opportunity to start. I didn't like the landing spot personally, but I like the idea. I don't like it. I am accepting that Carson Wentz has missed considerable games, 2 of the last 4. So sandwiched in between, played 13 games, 11 games. So the opportunity's there. If he wants to get fantasy relevance, you need to play. Sitting on the bench is not exactly a way to accumulate points unless we do the team build. And then from a social standpoint, Jeffrey Lurie has been very heavily invested with Hillary Clinton. He's anti-Trump. If we're going to take a social stance, obviously I think people would back his belief in that, giving Kaepernick the opportunity. And he's already come out and said he endorses all of his players to kneel during the anthem and join in unity. So, on both sides of that, from the actual opportunity situation, you're going to want to get behind a person who might not be playing every single game, even though he played all 16 last year. And given, in this case, I'm not the biggest, I'd say, believer in him stepping on the field. Ken talks about Russell Wilson, being 32. Kaepernick's 32. So the age isn't exactly working in his favor, but there is something to be said about that. So, I mean, if given the chance, if he's actually is healthy, the question I have also stems across, how much is he going to ask to play? Oliver Luck mentioned in an article that when he was part of the AAF, he had requested Kaepernick that is $20 million a year. And he denies that he asked for $20 million recently through the XFL because the XFL was never going to be able to give him that much money. What team can afford to pay that type of contract if we ever find out what it is? So then you have a salary cap constraints. There's a lot of moving pieces, and Philly does have some room.
That's a good point. But just to backtrack a little bit, what you said, I believe the president came out today and did say that he would be for Colin Kaepernick returning to the NFL if he was up to snuff, to use his words there.
The president of what?
The United States of America.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So he did say that. So
he did, didn't he?
Politics on another podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, sorry.
Let's get into something that's equally controversial. Let's get into COVID-19, folks, because it's here, it's back, it's not going away. I should say it never left. And of course, everybody heard yesterday Ezekiel Elliott was asymptomatic for COVID-19. I don't know if this was I don't know if this was in the past month or the past couple months. I didn't fully read that part, but he was asymptomatic. Aaron, what does that mean?
All right. That's a loaded question. Ezekiel Elliott,
medical expert here on Fantasy and Frames.
Yeah, Ezekiel Elliott has COVID-19. Period. So asymptomatic means it doesn't mean much. It means how he's presenting with the virus. So he's presenting with the virus with no symptoms. That's all that the word asymptomatic means. So when you hear that, that's literally all it means. He doesn't have any of the classic symptoms. It doesn't mean that he doesn't feel bad. It just means he doesn't have, the 100 symptoms that are COVID-19: fever, chills, shortness of breath, cough, diarrhea, loss of taste or smell, all these things that you hear about every single day. He has none of those things. It doesn't mean he doesn't have the virus, and doesn't mean that he can't show symptoms just later than other people. He may have contracted the virus like 2 or 3 days prior to testing positive, and now he's on day 5 or 6, and he may start to get a cough or something like that. What does this mean for fantasy football? Well, I think it means, and I caution myself by saying I think it means because I have no idea how this virus will ever work. And I'm not the only one. Yeah. And I'm not the only one who doesn't know how this virus is going to work. I think it means that good news for Ezekiel Elliott, one, that he doesn't have any symptoms yet. And so the idea that he's going to overcome the virus, he has his age, his health, and now his lack of symptoms with a positive test all in his favor. Great news. And I think for fantasy football, him being positive in June is a lot better than him being positive in October. And I know we're going to get to that a little bit further down the line. Right. I don't think this is going to impact Ezekiel Elliott's season at this point. I caution you to say that we don't know if you can get if there's a different strand, how many strands, or flu A versus flu B, COVID-19 A versus COVID-19 B. These are all things the whole world's going to learn together. So as of right now, what we know about COVID-19 and what we know about Ezekiel Elliott and the timing, pretty, fair to good news for him, and no fantasy impact here. None.
Well, let's talk about how the coronavirus could impact, draft strategy, for example, in fantasy football. Here at Fantasy and Frames, we cover redraft. So of course, redraft doesn't really kick into high gear until late July and August. But there are fantasy drafts, there are best ball drafts going on, and I'm sure people are bored, and there are probably a few redraft leagues going on. In terms of drafting right now.
The maniacs are drafting, Jorge.
So I was having this conversation with Fantasy Stoner over on Twitter. You can follow at Fantasy FB Stoner, chill guy. See what I did there? So we're having this conversation as far as, flex options, handcuffs, and, because of everything that's going on with the coronavirus and the potential for people to get infected, especially our top stars, like our running backs, for example, is that going to cause people to want to draft handcuffs early? Is there even such a thing as a handcuff anymore because of the coronavirus? And is everybody just basically flex viable and should be treated that way? Nate, I want to get your opinion on this first. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. A handcuff is a handcuff. I will never jeopardize improving a position overall by taking a potential backup or a potential fill-in for the unknown. And that, I mean, the fact of the matter is if you do that, if nothing does, you've wasted viable draft capital. And the draft capital or opportunity cost, as a friend of our show, JJ Zachariason, will say, is that is not a worthy investment. You don't get rid of potential upside or potential cost to take a gamble or a roll the dice.
That's a good point. Aaron, what are your thoughts there?
Specifically speaking to handcuffs and COVID-19, I don't think that those two things are connected in the way that a lot of fantasy writers and experts want you to believe right now. If you do a quick search for Tony Pollard, Alexander Madison, Latavius Murray, if you do a quick search for these, you're likely to find an article that says, if there's any year that you need to have these guys, it's this year. And I don't believe that's true. I don't believe that you should be in the business of predicting when someone's going to catch a respiratory virus. And if you think when Alvin Kamara is going to catch this thing and you're like smarter than the rest of the world, so you're grabbing Latavius Murray in the 5th round of all your drafts, I mean, you probably should, call the CDC or whatever and give them your tracking information on the virus, because this thing is not as predictable as every other fantasy football season that's ever been played, and how tons of these handcuff running backs who can't miss guys going into seasons are just total wasted early to mid round draft selections in every single season that has ever been.
All right, Ken, what are your thoughts on this real quick?
I just look at it as you don't go into this thinking that somebody's going to have the coronavirus. You got to go into it thinking the same thing like you do with every other season, with every other running back you have. If you think that the running back is a viable injury threat to you, then maybe you look at a handcuff. But if you're going in thinking, well, this guy might have COVID, or this guy might, which guy might have COVID, you want to talk about a lottery pick. Just pick a running back out of a hat and say, this guy's going to get COVID, and right, I'll take his backup running back. If you're going into your draft with that kind of strategy, then you got a lot more problems than just that. So that's not, to me, that's not a viable draft strategy.
No, and I hear people actually still talking about, well, maybe should Zeke be the overall number 1 now, because the antibodies have now come into effect and he guarantees or reduces that. I don't know if that's true. I mean, there's staggering statistics about this antibody, that the testing that goes on. I mean, there was a nursing home. Aaron, you'll agree. The most prevalent situations of people that have come down with COVID-19 and had the worst effects typically are the elderly with underlying disease or symptoms. There was a nursing home in Washington State that had 26 documented cases of COVID-19. 14 of this 26 were asymptomatic. Now, that doesn't make sense. But then again, you look at athletes and you're trying to predict which, the creme de la creme, the elite athletic people are going to have either the antibodies that hold up. I don't know. I feel like people, I'll let other people, like Aaron, we said, and Jorge and Ken, let the other people draft that. That means we're just going to get an extra good, a better pick in the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th rounds and have a better chance.
All right.
Yeah.
So
let me just nail that home real fast, because that's the point that I don't want anyone to miss. And Nate is spot on. You can actually use this idea that people think that they know how COVID-19 is going to play out, and how they believe that having handcuffs or these backup running backs are the way to go in 2020. You could use that to your advantage and just take the players who are going to play in those spots. There are players that they're going to pass on to take these guys, and you need to be the one right there to scoop up the players that should be going.
Well, then these are very good points, gentlemen. Now let's take it a step further. If we're not going to alter our draft strategy, what are we going to do as far as our league settings are concerned? Nate, what are your thoughts there?
I mean, there's only one thing for me. I would increase the amount of IR spots or COVID spots or whatever you want to consider it. I mean, you accommodate for the league as a whole. Make sure that people aren't just completely scrambling to the waiver wire. I think that puts an importance on waiver claims. I think the FAB becomes more likely than the reverse waiver. Personally, I think that then a little bit more strategy involved. But just increase the IR. That's the only setting that if I was starting a league right now, which coincidentally I am. If you've heard of it, it's the fantasy. We won't go there.
It's a 4A championship.
I know what it's called. But that's it. That's the only adoption that I would maybe or change whatsoever would be maybe a few more of those spots.
Ken, quickly, what are your thoughts on this book?
I agree with Nate on that, and also, this might be a year where you might want to experiment on different types of leagues. I mean, this might be a year where you want to try a best ball league, and maybe this is a best ball league would suit this kind of fear or whatever you want to call it better in a league like this, where I'll test out a best ball league and
you're drafting for upside in best ball, right?
Draft all the. I'm sorry.
I mean, you're drafting for upside in best ball leagues, and so you can take the risk of, drafting multiple running backs, and one of them is going to pay off,
right,
versus committing yourself to like a redraft league, right?
Right, exactly. So that's one area where I'd see that maybe this not help, but this would work out, is just testing something like a best ball league or something like that.
Right. Aaron, were you going to say something?
Patiently waiting to say this. The most important thing you can do in your league settings in 2020 is to set a rule for COVID-19, whether it be individual players, follow what the NFL process is, and when the league gets a bunch of high-profile cases, if that should happen, fantasy football is going to be an afterthought definitely to the NFL. The NFL is too smart of a organization. They have their finger on the pulse of the public, of the world. This is not just about the guys who are playing football, and they know that. This is about the cities that these players play in and exposing people unnecessarily to a virus that has killed hundreds of thousands of people across the globe. The NFL is not stupid. They are not going to mess around with this. When that first player we know catches coronavirus, all bets are out the window now for the NFL. I'm sure they'll have contingency plans in place to take everybody away and, quarantine them for weeks on end until they can safely get back to the field. But I think your fantasy leagues need to have a clause for COVID-19 as far as, especially if you're dealing with money, whether it's giving everybody their money back or, if there's a prize involved, who can claim that prize should the season stop prematurely.
Or, make sure all your leagues this year are geared towards charity, like our championships are. 100% agree. And that brings us to, the scrolling question at the bottom. Like, if there's an outbreak during the season, like, just with the proximity that these players are in, you could look at it in multiple directions. You could say, well, let's increase the roster size, and that'll compensate for if somebody goes down, somebody can come in and step in. Okay. Or you can get even more people infected with the outbreak. And I'm right there with you. Me personally, and I have no background in dealing with COVID-19 or whatnot, but I see one or two scenarios happening. This is just my gut feeling right now. Either the league starts off, Roger Goodell and the NFL are like, what, we're not going to follow in the footsteps of Major League Baseball. We're going to start this season on time. And, with all the projections that you're seeing out there with, flare-ups with COVID-19, October is that sweet spot where people are projecting, higher cases than normal and more deaths associated with this disease. And part of me thinks, maybe football stops in October. It starts in September, ends in October for a certain period of time. Another part of me thinks that maybe it starts in November or in December. when the schedule release happened back in May, first week of May, everything that they were talking about in terms of having contingencies for the NFL season was based on the whole Super Bowl date. They couldn't move the Super Bowl date, so everything revolves around the Super Bowl date. So if they're able to squeeze in a season starting mid-November and still keep the same Super Bowl date, sure. But the more time that's taken off the season, I don't know. I'm with you guys. I love fantasy football. I love talking football, and we will continue to talk about fantasy football. As you can see, we also talk about fantasy baseball. We'll talk about everything fantasy related, but we got to be realistic, and we can't just ignore the fact that this might not happen. And so you should have contingencies, and so like having that charitable clause, like we were talking about, or just having that conversation. It's uncomfortable conversations to have, guaranteed. But they should be had, and I think to just ignore them and treat the situation, treat the fantasy football world as it's everything's hunky dory. This is the wrong way to go about it.
I will say, if I could just jump in, I will say, and this is maybe sound a little bit weird, but we're still about 3.5 months away from the start of the season, and I know this is something that might roil some people, but trust the NFL. They have 3 months to plan this out. They actually have more than 3 months. They'll have at least 6 months to plan this out. They're going to make sure that as best as they can, they could play these games, whether it's, half stadiums full, no people in the stadiums, players being how they're going to be segregated and stuff. They are making plans as we speak to figure this out. And they've had 3 months prior and another 3 months. So they'll have 6 months to plan this out. So I'm not saying that like Jorge says, you should have contingencies. You should always have those contingencies, but I am not, at least me personally, am not worried that the NFL won't be able to play and at least play 90%, not 90%, but more than 75% of the season this year.
I mean, we'll find out. It's unknown waters that we're sailing through, gentlemen.
Right.
Ladies and gentlemen out there. And with that wraps up Behind the Frames episode 2. That was fun, guys, even though we kind of ended on a little somber note there. I think the important thing to take away is, not just for the NFL community, but like everyone out there, stay safe, be smart. And when you're planning your fantasy football leagues this year, plan them differently. Maybe, like we were saying, with the 4-out championships, and Aaron mentioned, and I mentioned, and I'll keep hammering this home, donate your league winnings to charity this year. Make it some kind of charitable cause. Make it worthwhile to play, because the motivation has to be there for everybody to participate in. And if we can find something good to come from all this bad that's happening, I think we're doing the fantasy community a huge service right there. So for Ken, for Nate, for Aaron, gentlemen, thank you very much. Don't forget to check out all of our articles at fantasyandframes.com, as well as our podcast episodes. I'm Jorge. We'll see you next week, folks.
Cheers.